All right, police abolition and the abolition movement. I think in the resources that I sent out, they kind of identified two main problems with policing in America. And so in her Vanity Fair article, Josie Duffy Rice identifies the problem of American policing as the consistent application of violent solutions to nonviolent and often non-existent problems. And then secondly, is policing's historical role as enforcers of racial and class-based apartheid, going all the way back to the police's origins in slave patrols and returning runaway slaves to their owners, and then post-slavery as enforcers of the Black Codes, which were laws that were created post-Reconstruction firstly to control and to control the Black population, but also to then fill this new need for free labor, which was taken away from the owning class of the South by the emancipation of slavery. And the way to do this was this new system, this prison lease system, whereby convicts were leased out to work groups, and basically, basically slavery 2.0. And yes, police were the enforcement arm of that. And then to today, we have our, hotspot policing is one way they talk about it, that serves to intimidate, surveil, and enact violence against communities of color and poor people. And so, again, from Josie Duffy Rice's article in Vanity Fair, what is hotspot policing? According to the National Institute of Justice survey, it includes order maintenance and drug enforcement crackdowns, increased gun searches and seizures, and zero tolerance policing. This isn't just a list of policing tactics, it's a list of prerequisites for the present moment. For order maintenance, Eric Garner was suffocated on a New York sidewalk. For drug enforcement crackdowns, Breonna Taylor was killed in her own home. For gun search and seizure, the Black neighborhoods of New York endured stop and frisk. And I would add to that category the killing of Dalal Eid in Minneapolis last week. And for zero tolerance policing, George Floyd was choked on a Minneapolis street. So, proponents of police abolition assert that the institution is unreformable, and they cite countless failed reform attempts stretching back over a century, and just a long history of police ignoring rules and aggressively resisting any accountability, often via their police unions, their politically powerful police unions. Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls this lawfare, and she uses, for example, the legal precedent of police killings being ruled justified if the officer merely states that they feared for their life. But ultimately, attempts to rein in the violence of policing failed because the job of police is the application of state violence. And so the big question, I guess, is what about crime, right? Well, police don't prevent crime, right? They respond to it and apply punishment, often violent punishment, or they funnel offenders into the prison system, another form of state violence. So the abolition movement seeks to eliminate harm in society. And they ask, I guess, in that they ask, to that end, they ask two important questions. What is it that makes people's lives vulnerable? And what is crime? So I'm going to do the crime question first. Definitions of crime are socially constructed. There are violent crimes, of course, that most all of us would agree cause harm, like murder, sexual assault, etc. But much of what we call crime has been designated as such intentionally to target marginalized communities and is selectively enforced along racial and class lines. So, for example, again, the black codes that I mentioned, these were a whole just basket full of laws. They were, varied some from state to state. Formed at, put into effect after Reconstruction to regain the powerful Southern owning class to regain control over the Black population, and to essentially criminalize Blackness. So the laws could be, against loitering, vagrancy. There was a law requiring written evidence of employment. Some states had laws restricting the occupations that Black people could hold. Anything, basically, anything that could be used to criminalize Black behavior in order, again, to control, but also, importantly, to feed bodies into the prison lease system. So this was a way to hold on to the economic advantage of free labor for powerful interests in the South and in the North, who, just as in slavery, benefited indirectly from the economic returns of slavery and later prison lease, and now everything they do now. So some of these laws were explicitly applied to Black people, or they were just simply unenforced against white people. Another example would be the war on drugs, and especially the sentencing disparities for drug crimes that evolved in that time, where like 1 gram of crack cocaine, which was more widely used in poor Black and minority communities, carried the same sentence, the same length of time for 100 grams of powdered cocaine, which was more widely used by whites, was like the big Wall Street thing. Another facet of this is the criminalization of people of color in the popular imagination. So we hear things in the media like Black youth being described as super predators and thugs, Black women as welfare queens. More recently, Trump with his, immigrants are rapists and bad people, etc. So it goes on and on. Abolitionists do not dismiss the need for accountability for harm caused, right? In another article that I don't think I sent out, Maryam Kaba and what is her name, Andrea J. Ritchie, describe a reparations framework for accountability, which has 5 elements. They are repair, restoration, acknowledgement, cessation, and non-repetition. And to paint an example of how this would work, they apply this framework to the Breonna Taylor case. And so I'm going to read a long quote from that article. Under this framework, there's no question Brianna's family is entitled to accountability, including immediate termination of the officers involved in her killing and banning them from any future position that would allow them to carry a weapon or hold a position of power that can be abused in the way they abused it in Brianna's case. They, the family, are also entitled to a process through which the officers must hear and be accountable to their pain, know the full value of the life they took, and make amends to our collective satisfaction. Brianna's family is entitled to repair, compensation for their pain and suffering, without the necessity of having to endure lengthy litigation during which their loved one's reputation, history, associations, and character will be assailed, without having to look over and over at an incident report that states that no one was injured when their daughter and sister bled out in her bed in a hail of bullets, and without having to pay extensive litigation costs and undergo additional suffering through the process. They are also entitled to restoration and healing services. Under a reparations framework, Brianna's family and all of us are also entitled to more than an individualized response to what is a systemic problem. We are entitled to immediate cessation of the actions that caused her death. No-knock warrants, to be sure, but also short-knock warrants and dangerous drug raids in all their forms. And all of us are entitled to non-repetition, an end to the conditions that produced her death, including an end to the drug war that killed her and the forces of gentrification that brought police into her neighborhood. So that was a long quote. That's a great article. I will put a link to it on Slack. So then if we go back to the first question, what is it that makes people's lives vulnerable? And this, for me anyway, is really, I think, the core of abolition and the most exciting in terms of what it requires us to imagine for our society. It speaks to ideas we've heard a lot about this last year around defunding police in order to fund social services like mental health support, drug rehabilitation programs and harm reduction, domestic abuse shelters, like we saw in Barron County with the Embrace situation. And you know, things that would keep police from responding to situations they aren't trained for and don't have the means to resolve. But also, it speaks to ideas like free and equitable public education, universal basic income, meaningful climate action and environmental justice. For me, like this is the true promise of abolition. Not simply the removal of institutions like police and prisons from our society, but an entire reimagining of how our society is structured. From one of endless control and punishment, where power, wealth, and resources are hoarded by a tiny minority at the top, to one of care and reciprocity, where everybody's needs are met and power is held and wielded by communities and not individuals.